Some men think power is a loud voice and a loaded gun. They're wrong. Power is knowing exactly what the person across the table is whispering when they assume you are deaf to their world. Gabriel thought he held all the cards in the private dining room of the Florentine. He was untouchable, until he made the fatal mistake of looking at the exhausted girl pouring his scotch and treating her like a punchline. She wasn't a joke. She was his only warning. Invisibility was a learned skill. It didn't happen overnight. It took months of practice to strip the humanity from your own face, to flatten your spine, to become nothing more than a pair of disembodied hands delivering plates of seared scallops and clearing away empty crystal wine glasses. Claire had mastered it. She stood in the dimly lit alcove of the Florentine, a high-end dining establishment where a steak cost more than her weekly grocery budget, and watched the room. The air was thick with the scent of roasted garlic, expensive truffles, and the sharp metallic tang of unearned arrogance. It was a Tuesday night. The weekend crowd was loud and obnoxious, but the Tuesday crowd was dangerous. Tuesday was for men in bespoke Italian suits who spoke in low, measured tones. Tuesday was for handshakes that sealed fates. Claire adjusted the stiff white collar of her uniform. It choked her, just a little, a constant physical reminder of her place in the hierarchy. She was 26 years old. She had a master's degree in applied linguistics and a minor in Eastern European dialects. She could conjugate verbs in 7 languages. She could tell you the exact region of the Ural Mountains a person grew up in just by the way they pronounced their vowels. And yet, her greatest asset in life was her ability to remain completely unnoticed while scraping half-eaten caviar into a garbage can. Academia had been a dead end. Funding dried up. Grants were given to those who played the political game better than she did. Left with a mountain of student debt and a landlord who didn't accept phonetic transcriptions as rent, Claire took the only job that paid cash fast enough to keep the lights on. She learned quickly that rich people do not see service workers as human beings. They view them as furniture that occasionally speaks. They will discuss infidelity, insider trading, and federal crimes while you are standing 2 feet away, pouring their sparkling water. They assume that if you are wearing an apron, you lack the cognitive capacity to comprehend their complex, elevated lives. "Table 4 needs another round of martinis," Paul, the floor manager, hissed as he scurried past her. He was a perpetually sweating man whose entire existence was defined by the fear of a bad Yelp review. "And Table 7 is complaining about the draft?" Claire nodded. She didn't speak. Speaking wasted energy. She moved through the dining room with practiced grace. She knew the exact geometry of the floor plan. She knew how to pivot her hips to avoid the swinging kitchen doors. She knew how to pour a bottle of Barolo without letting a single drop stain the pristine white tablecloth. She was a machine. A highly educated, deeply cynical, underpaid machine. She dropped the martinis at Table 4 without making eye contact. The men were discussing a merger. They were laughing about firing 300 factory workers. Claire felt a familiar, cold knot in her stomach, but she kept her face carefully blank. She retreated to the shadows. It was exhausting, holding all these secrets. Her brain was a sponge, constantly absorbing the raw, unfiltered truth of the city's elite. She heard everything. She understood everything. Sometimes the sheer volume of overheard malice made her want to scream, to flip a table and remind them that she was a person. But pride didn't pay the heating bill. Silence did. She leaned against the cool plaster of the alcove wall and closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. Just 1 more hour. 1 more hour, and she could take off the collar. She could go home to her cramped apartment, make a cheap cup of tea, and read a book that didn't involve profit margins or luxury tax. "Claire," Paul's voice snapped her eyes open. He wasn't sweating anymore. He was pale, a sickly, chalky white. He looked like a man who had just been told his parachute was packed with dirty laundry. "The private room," Paul whispered, his eyes darting frantically towards the heavy oak doors at the back of the restaurant. "I thought it was empty tonight," she said. "It was, until 10 minutes ago." Paul swallowed hard. "Russo is here." Claire didn't react outwardly, but the temperature in the alcove seemed to drop 10 degrees. Everyone in the city knew the name Gabriel Russo. You didn't read it in the social pages, you read it in the obituaries. Or, more accurately, you read about the sudden tragic accidents of the people who crossed him. He was the head of a syndicate that controlled the docks, the shipping lanes, and a significant portion of the city's underground economy. "He requested the room," Paul continued, wringing his hands. "He's meeting with some associates, foreign gentlemen. They specifically asked for a server who wouldn't be a nuisance." He looked at Claire. "You're our best ghost. Don't look at them. Don't listen to them. Just keep the glasses full and get out." Claire took a deep breath. She smoothed the front of her black vest. "Understood." She grabbed a fresh tray, loaded it with 2 carafes of filtered water, and walked toward the heavy oak doors. She had served dangerous men before. They were usually loud, boisterous, trying to prove how tough they were. But as she pushed the brass handle and slipped into the private dining room, she realized this was entirely different. There was no boasting. There was only a suffocating, heavy silence. The kind of silence that precedes a car crash. The private room was insulated from the rest of the restaurant. The walls were lined with dark mahogany and heavy velvet drapes that swallowed sound. A single, low-hanging chandelier cast a pool of amber light over the round oak table in the center. 4 men sat at the table. Claire stepped into the room, her footsteps completely silent on the thick Persian rug. She didn't look at their faces. She looked at their hands, their posture, the geometry of their seating arrangement. 2 men sat on the far side. They were built like freight trains, wearing suits that barely contained their wide shoulders. They sat rigidly, their eyes scanning the room with the mechanical precision of security cameras. Between them sat a much older man. He had a face mapped with deep, harsh lines, pale skin, and eyes like chips of dirty ice. He wore a heavy wool suit that looked expensive but outdated, as if he had bought it in a different era. He was currently peeling an apple with a small, terrifyingly sharp silver pocket knife, the blade moving with practiced fluid motion. And then there was the man sitting with his back to the door. Even from behind, Gabriel Russo commanded the space. He didn't slouch, but he wasn't rigid like the bodyguards. He sat with the relaxed, terrifying ease of an apex predator resting in the sun. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit that molded to the broad line of his shoulders. His dark hair was neatly trimmed. As Claire approached the table, he shifted slightly, and she caught a glimpse of his profile. He was strikingly handsome, but there was a sharp, brutal edge to his features. His jaw was locked, his dark eyes fixed on the older man across from him. There was no warmth in him. He looked like a man who had carved his heart out a long time ago, just to save weight. "I am not an unreasonable man, Grigory," Gabriel said. His voice was smooth, deep, and carried a faint, polished rasp. It was the voice of a man who rarely had to raise it to be obeyed. The older man, Grigory, did not stop peeling his apple. He kept his eyes on the curling ribbon of red skin. "Reasonable is a subjective word, Mr. Russo. In my country, a reasonable man is a dead man. I prefer to be profitable." Grigory's English was heavily accented, halting but precise. It was the kind of English learned out of necessity, not pleasure. Claire moved in close to the table. She was a shadow. She filled Gabriel's water glass first, lifting the carafe high and cutting the stream perfectly so not a single drop splashed. She moved to Grigory, repeating the motion. Neither man acknowledged her existence. She was performing flawlessly. 30% is an insult," Gabriel said, leaning forward slightly. He steepled his fingers on the table. I control the ports. You bring the cargo in. I make sure the customs agents look the other way. I take all the local risk. 50% is the price of doing business. Grigory finally looked up. He sliced a piece of the apple and popped it into his mouth, chewing slowly. He looked at Gabriel the way a scientist looks at a mildly interesting bug under a microscope. You control the docks, Grigory conceded, swallowing. But I control the supply. Without my cargo, your empty docks are just expensive concrete. 40%. That is my final offer. Or I take my business to the port in the south. The tension in the room spiked. The two massive bodyguards shifted slightly in their chairs. Claire could feel the violence humming in the air, a low-frequency vibration that rattled her teeth. She moved back to the side station, picking up a bottle of the 2010 Barolo Paul had decanted for them. Gabriel smiled. It was a cold, terrifying expression. It didn't reach his eyes. You and I both know the southern port is run by amateurs. They'll get your cargo seized by the feds before it even clears the breakwater. You need me, Grigory. You just don't want to admit it. He reached into his jacket pocket. The two bodyguards instantly tensed, their hands dropping below the table. Gabriel ignored them. He slowly pulled out a silver cigarette case, extracted a cigarette, and placed it between his lips. He didn't light it. He just let it hang there, a prop in a deadly play. 50%. Gabriel repeated softly. And I guarantee safe passage for every crate of rifles you bring into my city. You walk away with a clean profit and 0 headaches. Claire approached the table again, the heavy bottle of Barolo in her right hand, a white linen napkin folded over her left forearm. She needed to pour the wine and get out. The air in the room was becoming toxic. Grigory stared at Gabriel for a long, agonizing moment. The silence stretched so tight it threatened to snap and take someone's head off. Finally, the older man's harsh face cracked into a slow, grimacing smile. You are a very confident young man, Grigory said. He gestured with his silver knife. Fine. 50%. We have a deal. Gabriel's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, a microscopic release of tension. He had won. He had stared down a notorious Russian arms dealer and walked away with exactly what he wanted. Claire stepped up to Grigory's right side to pour his wine. Grigory turned his head slightly toward the bodyguard sitting to his left. He kept the grimacing smile on his face, looking entirely relaxed. Pretvoriaites chto soglasny, Grigory murmured in rapid, guttural Russian. Kak tolko on podpishet bumagi, ubit ego na parkovke. Zaberite verse. Claire's hand froze. It was a microsecond of hesitation, a tiny glitch in her programming. But a full bottle of Barolo is heavy, and gravity is unforgiving. A single drop of deep red wine escaped the lip of the bottle. It fell through the air in slow motion and landed squarely on the pristine white tablecloth, blooming instantly like a fresh gunshot wound. Claire sucked in a sharp breath, her heart slamming against her ribs. She understood him. She understood every single word. Grigory hadn't spoken standard textbook Russian. He had used a very specific, slurred street dialect common in the criminal underbelly of St. Petersburg, the kind of dialect she had spent 2 years writing a thesis on. Pretvoriaites chto soglasny. Pretend to agree. Kak tolko on podpishet bumagi, ubit ego na parkovke. As soon as he signs the papers, kill him in the parking garage. Zaberit vesa. Take everything. She stood frozen, the bottle hovering over the glass. Her mind raced. The man currently peeling an apple had just ordered the execution of the man sitting across from him. Gabriel stopped playing with his unlit cigarette. His dark, cold eyes slowly drifted from Grigory's face to the red stain on the tablecloth, and then, finally, up to Claire's face. The ghost had suddenly become visible. Gabriel Russo did not like being interrupted. He especially did not like being interrupted during the exact moment of his victory. He looked at the trembling waitress standing over the table, holding a bottle of wine like it was a live grenade. He took the cigarette from his mouth and placed it on the table. "Is there a problem?" Gabriel asked. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the heavy silence of the room like a razor blade. Claire tried to breathe. Her lungs felt like they were packed with wet sand. She looked at the red stain. I apologize, sir." The bottle slipped. "I will get a fresh cloth immediately." She stepped back, desperate to retreat to the safety of the kitchen, to run out the back door into the alley, to disappear completely. "Stop," Gabriel commanded. Claire froze. Her feet locked to the floor. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. He looked her up and down, dissecting her with a slow, contemptuous gaze. He had just won a massive negotiation. His ego was inflated. He needed an outlet for the residual adrenaline, and this clumsy girl in a cheap uniform was standing right in front of him. "You people charge $40 for a plate of pasta, and you can't even hire a girl who knows how to hold a bottle?" Gabriel sneered. He wasn't even looking at her anymore. He was looking at Grigori, using her to show off, to assert his dominance in the room. "They hire you off the street? Or are you just naturally stupid?" Grigori let out a dry, raspy chuckle. The two bodyguards smirked. A hot flush of humiliation crept up Claire's neck. She bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper. "Don't speak. Don't speak. You are furniture." "I apologize, Mr. Russo," Claire managed to whisper, keeping her eyes glued to the floor. "It was a mistake." "A mistake?" Gabriel mocked, his tone dripping with condescension. He picked up his empty crystal glass and held it out toward her. "Fill it, and if you spill another drop, I'll have the manager deduct the cost of the bottle from whatever pathetic wage they pay you." Claire stepped forward again. Her hands were shaking violently now. She reached out with the heavy bottle. She tipped it. As the dark red wine flowed into the glass, Gabriel decided he wasn't finished. "You see, Grigori, this is the problem with this city," Gabriel said, loud enough for her to hear every cruel syllable. "No one pays attention. No one uses their brain. They walk around in a daze, completely oblivious to what's happening right in front of their faces. Look at her. Blank stare. Empty head. I bet she couldn't string together a complex thought if her life depended on it." Claire stopped pouring. The glass was half full. She stood up straight. The fear was still there, a cold, heavy block of ice in her stomach. But underneath the fear, something else was waking up. A deep, simmering rage. She was tired. She was so incredibly tired of being treated like a piece of dirt on the bottom of a very expensive shoe. She looked at Gabriel. Really looked at him. He was arrogant. He was cruel. He was a criminal who destroyed lives for a living. And in roughly 20 minutes, when he walked down to the subterranean parking garage, he was going to get a bullet in the back of his head. Let him die. A voice whispered in her mind. He deserves it. Just walk away. But she couldn't. She couldn't just walk away and let a man be butchered because she was too afraid to speak. Gabriel frowned, annoyed by her sudden stillness. "What are you staring at? I told you to fill the glass." "You're wrong," Claire said. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Her voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was clear. It was steady. It rang out in the quiet room. The two bodyguards stopped smirking. Grigori stopped peeling his apple. Gabriel tilted his head, his eyes narrowing to dark slits. "Excuse me?" Claire looked directly into Gabriel Russo's cold, dead eyes. She didn't look away. For the first time in 3 years, she took off the mask. "You said I'm oblivious. You said I have an empty head," Claire said, her voice remarkably calm, despite the frantic hammering of her heart. "But you're the one sitting here, celebrating a victory you didn't win, in a language you don't understand." Gabriel's jaw tightened. The air in the room instantly turned lethal. "You have exactly 3 seconds to get out of my sight before I ruin your life." "He didn't agree to your deal," Claire said, pointing a steady finger at Grigory. Grigory's face turned completely white. The older man dropped the silver knife. It clattered loudly against the china plate. Gabriel didn't look at Grigory. He kept his eyes locked on Claire, a dangerous, predatory focus zeroing in on her. "What did you say?" "You think you're so smart?" Claire threw his own insult back at him, the rage fully taking over now. She didn't care about the job. She didn't care about Paul. She was done. "You think you hold all the cards? You're blind, Mr. Russo. He just gave the order." Gabriel slowly stood up from his chair. The movement was smooth, utterly silent, and terrifying. He looked at Claire, and for the first time, he actually saw her. He saw the intelligence burning in her eyes. He saw the defiance. "If you're so smart," Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal hum, "then translate it." Claire didn't hesitate. She looked at Grigory, who was now slowly reaching into his jacket. He said, "Pretend to agree." Claire translated, her voice ringing with perfect, chilling clarity. He said, "As soon as he signs the papers, kill him in the parking garage." And then he told them to take everything. Silence. Total, absolute silence. It was a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. Gabriel froze. The smug arrogance, the cruel amusement, the absolute certainty of his own power. It all vanished in a fraction of a second. His face went perfectly blank. He didn't turn around. He didn't look at Grigory. He just stood there, staring at the waitress he had just humiliated, realizing with a cold, terrifying shock that the invisible girl in the cheap uniform had just saved his life. The silence shattered. One of the bodyguards lunged. "Violence in movies is choreographed. It has a rhythm, a build-up, a dramatic pause before the first punch is thrown. Real violence is just physics and panic. It happens faster than the human brain can process the visual data." The bodyguard on Grigory's left didn't reach for a holster. His gun was already in his hand, resting on his thigh beneath the tablecloth. He simply leveled it and fired through the heavy oak wood. The sound was catastrophic. It didn't sound like a cinematic pop. It sounded like a shipping container being dropped onto a concrete floor inside a tin can. Gabriel was already moving. The microsecond Claire had finished her translation, his arrogant stillness had shattered. He didn't dive backward. He shoved the heavy table forward with a brutal, explosive thrust of his legs. The edge of the oak caught the firing bodyguard in the chest, pinning him between the table and his chair. The bullet splintered the wood and ripped through the fabric of Gabriel's suit jacket, missing his ribs by a fraction of an inch. Claire hit the floor. She didn't make a conscious decision to fall. Her knees simply ceased to function. She collapsed onto the thick Persian rug, her hands flying over her ears, her eyes squeezed shut. The bottle of Barolo shattered next to her, spraying dark wine and jagged green glass across her forearms. Above her, the room tore itself apart. Gabriel drew his weapon from a shoulder holster in a blur of dark fabric. He didn't hesitate. He shot the pinned bodyguard twice in the chest. The man slumped over the ruined table. The second bodyguard lunged over the mahogany surface, a massive combat knife flashing in the amber light of the chandelier. Gabriel sidestepped, grabbed the man's extended wrist, and twisted it with a sickening, audible snap. As the man roared, Gabriel drove the butt of his gun into the bodyguard's temple. The giant crumpled instantly, a heavy, lifeless sack of meat hitting the floorboards. Grigory was scrambling backward, his chair toppling over. The older man's face was a mask of sheer terror. The slurred, confident street Russian was gone, replaced by frantic gasps for air. He was clawing at the heavy velvet drapes, trying to find the hidden service door behind them. Gabriel stood perfectly still amidst the carnage. He leveled his weapon at the back of Grigory's head. You should have taken the 40%, Gabriel said. He pulled the trigger. The deafening crack echoed off the mahogany walls. Grigory's body jerked forward, collapsing into a heap tangled in the heavy red velvet. Silence slammed back into the room. It was heavier now. It smelled of sulfur, burnt gunpowder, and the metallic tang of fresh casualties. Under the table, Claire was trembling so violently her teeth rattled. She kept her eyes squeezed shut. Her academic brain, the part that analyzed phonetics and syntax, was desperately trying to categorize the sounds. Gunfire, approximately 120 decibels. Bone-breaking, fabric-tearing. It was a pathetic coping mechanism, a way to insulate herself from the horrific reality of the room. A hand grabbed her upper arm. Claire shrieked, a raw, ugly sound, and thrashed backward. "Get up!" a voice commanded. She opened her eyes. Gabriel was crouching beside her. His dark suit was covered in splinters and dust. His face was entirely devoid of the cruel amusement he had worn 10 minutes ago. It was a mask of cold, terrifying calculation. He wasn't looking at her like she was a person. He was looking at her like she was a loose end. "I can't," she gasped, her voice completely stripped of breath. "I can't feel my legs. You have 10 seconds before Grigory's men in the garage realize he missed his check-in," Gabriel said, his grip on her arm tightening painfully. "If they find you in this room, they will skin you alive to find out what you heard. Get up!" He didn't wait for her muscles to remember how to work. He hauled her to her feet with one arm. The room spun. Claire swayed heavily against him, her boots slipping on the slick mixture of spilled wine and shattered glass. Gabriel caught her by the waist, steadying her with a bruising grip. "The front entrance is dead," Gabriel muttered, his eyes scanning the walls. "They'll have men on the floor. Where does the kitchen lead?" "Alley," Claire stammered, her mind struggling to catch up. "Dumpsters, loading dock. Move." He shoved her forward. Claire stumbled, catching her balance just before hitting the wall, and pushed through the heavy oak doors. The transition from the private dining room to the main hallway was jarring. The muted, muffled sounds of the restaurant's ambient music filtered through. No one in the main dining area had heard the gunfire. The heavy insulation of the private room had worked perfectly. They were eating scallops and discussing stock portfolios, completely unaware of the slaughter 50 feet away. Gabriel kept his gun pressed flat against his leg, hidden by the line of his trousers. He clamped his left hand onto the back of Claire's neck, his fingers pressing into her skin. "Walk normally," he breathed into her ear. "If you scream, if you alert anyone, I leave you here for them." Claire swallowed a sob. She nodded, a stiff, robotic jerk of her head. They bypassed the main floor, turning down the narrow, brightly lit corridor that led to the kitchen. The temperature spiked instantly. The air was thick with steam, burning butter and shouting cooks. Paul, the manager, was standing by the expediting station, screaming at a sous chef about a delayed risotto. He turned as Claire and Gabriel burst through the swinging doors. Paul's mouth fell open. He looked at Gabriel, at the splintered tear in the Mafia boss's suit jacket, and then at the terrifying grip he had on his waitress's neck. "Mr. Russo," Paul squeaked, his clipboard dropping to the floor, "is everything—" "Quiet!" Gabriel snapped, not breaking his stride. He shoved a busboy out of the way, dragging Claire through the chaotic maze of stainless steel prep tables and boiling pots. "Where is the loading dock door?" "Back right," Claire choked out. "Past the walk-in freezer." A dishwasher dropped a rack of plates. The ceramic shattered, sounding exactly like the gunfire from the other room. Claire flinched violently, her knees buckling. Gabriel caught her again, hauling her upright by the collar of her cheap uniform. "Don't fall apart on me now," he growled. They reached the heavy steel fire door at the back. Gabriel kicked the crash bar. The door flew open, dumping them out into the freezing, rain-slicked alleyway. The shock of the cold air felt like a slap. The alley was dark, illuminated only by the sickly yellow glow of a single street lamp flickering near the dumpsters. It smelled of rotting produce and wet asphalt. Gabriel immediately pushed Claire against the rough brick wall and pinned her there with his forearm. He raised his weapon, sweeping the alley in both directions. His breathing was steady. He wasn't panicked. He was simply working a problem. Claire pressed the back of her head against the freezing brick. Her chest heaved. She looked down at her hands. They were covered in someone else's blood. The bodyguards? Grigory's? She couldn't tell. She felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in her throat. "I speak 7 languages," she thought wildly. "I have a master's degree. I was supposed to be a translator for the UN. Now I'm dying behind a dumpster because a man spilled wine." Gabriel reached into his pocket with his free hand and pulled out a burner phone. He dialed a single digit and held it to his ear. "Leo, it's a mess. The Russian set a trap. The garage is compromised," Gabriel said, his voice clipped and devoid of emotion. "I'm in the North Alley. Bring the car. 3 minutes or I'm walking." He hung up. He lowered his arm from Claire's chest, but stayed standing directly in front of her, blocking her in. He finally looked at her. Under the sickly yellow light, he looked entirely different than he had in the dining room. The polished arrogance was stripped away. This was the real Gabriel Russo, a man who survived by being faster and more brutal than everyone else. "You left your coat," he noted, his voice flat. "I left my life." Claire shot back, her voice shaking but laced with a sudden, vicious cynicism. The fear was morphing into anger again. "My purse, my keys, my rent money." "You won't need it," Gabriel said. Before Claire could pass the terrifying implication of that statement, the roar of a heavy engine echoed down the narrow brick corridor. A massive matte black SUV tore around the corner, its headlights cut. The tires screeched as it halted inches from the dumpsters. The rear door flew open. "Get in," Gabriel ordered. Claire hesitated. Stepping into that vehicle meant crossing a line she could never uncross. It meant stepping permanently into the dark. Gabriel saw the hesitation. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip inescapable. "They know your face, Claire. They know what you wear. If you stay on this street, you are a dead woman by midnight. Get in the car." He didn't wait for her to agree. He shoved her into the leather interior of the SUV and climbed in behind her, slamming the heavy armored door shut. The interior of the SUV was silent, soundproofed against the city outside. The glass was tinted pitch black. They were moving fast, taking sharp turns that threw Claire against the leather armrest, but the suspension swallowed the bumps of the ruined asphalt. The driver, a massive man with a thick neck and a shaved head, didn't ask questions. He just drove. Gabriel sat in the seat opposite Claire. The adrenaline was beginning to drain from the small cabin, leaving behind a cold, clinical reality. He unbuttoned his ruined suit jacket, wincing slightly as he touched his ribs where the bullet had grazed the heavy fabric, bruising the muscle beneath. He didn't pull a gun on her. He didn't need to. He just watched her. Claire sat with her knees pulled tightly together, her bloody hands clasped in her lap. The heater in the SUV was blasting, but she couldn't stop shivering. She stared at the floor mats. She was trying to build a wall in her mind, brick by brick, shutting out the memory of the heavy, wet sound Grigory's body made when it hit the floor. "Who sent you?" Gabriel's voice broke the silence. It wasn't a threat. It was a genuine inquiry. He sounded almost intensely curious. Claire looked up. "What? Who do you work for?" Gabriel asked, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His dark eyes searched her face, looking for micro-expressions, looking for a lie. "The feds? A rival family? You were planted there." No restaurant hires a waitress who speaks St. Petersburg gutter trash Russian. Claire stared at him. The sheer absurdity of the question hung in the air. A sharp, barking laugh escaped her lips. It was entirely involuntary. She clamped a hand over her mouth, but another laugh pushed through. It sounded broken and cynical. Gabriel's brow furrowed. He wasn't used to people laughing at him, especially not people covered in blood in the back of his getaway car. "I work for Paul," Claire said, dropping her hand. Her voice was flat, exhausted. "I work for tips. I work for minimum wage minus taxes. No one sent me, Mr. Russo. I am exactly what you called me, a waitress." "Bullshit," Gabriel said softly. "You didn't hesitate. You translated a kill order perfectly, without stammering, under immense pressure. You stood your ground against me. You are trained." "I have a Master of Arts in Applied Linguistics," Claire snapped, the academic in her suddenly deeply offended by his ignorance. "My thesis was on the sociolinguistic evolution of criminal dialects in post-Soviet Russia. I spent 2 years listening to wiretaps for a university grant." Gabriel stared at her. The silence stretched. "You're a student," he said slowly, testing the word on his tongue like it was a foreign concept. "I was a student until the grant money dried up and the university gave my funding to the dean's nephew," Claire said bitterly. "So I took a job pouring water for men who wear suits that cost more than my car, because my landlord threatened to evict me." She leaned back against the leather seat, closing her eyes. "You called me stupid. You said I had an empty head. You paraded your ego around that room, completely oblivious to the fact that you were sitting across from a man who was organizing your funeral. If I hadn't spent 3 years analyzing gang syntax, you would be bleeding out on the concrete right now." She didn't know where the courage came from. Maybe it was the shock. Maybe she had just completely detached from reality. But she opened her eyes and met his gaze evenly. "So don't ask me who sent me. No one sent me. I just happened to be the only person in the room who actually paid attention." Gabriel didn't yell. He didn't threaten her. He simply sat back in his seat, the leather creaking slightly under his weight. He was a man who prided himself on reading people. He survived by knowing exactly what everyone in a room was capable of. He looked at the exhausted, terrified, deeply cynical woman sitting across from him, and he realized, with a profound sense of unease, that he had failed completely. He had looked right at her, and he had seen absolutely nothing. "I was wrong," Gabriel said. The words were quiet, but they felt momentous. They sounded rusty, like they hadn't been used in a decade. Claire blinked, startled by the admission. "What?" "I said I was wrong about you," Gabriel repeated, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The predatory intensity was back, but it had shifted. It was no longer dismissive. It was a heavy, calculated focus. "You aren't empty-headed." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a clean white handkerchief. He leaned forward and held it out to her. Claire looked at the pristine fabric, then down at her bloody hands. She took it slowly. "But you're right about one thing," Gabriel continued, his voice dropping an octave, smoothing out into that terrifying, polished rasp. "You left your life behind in that alcove. Grigori's surviving men will tear this city apart looking for the leak. When they find out the waitress vanished, they will track your address. They will wait for you." Claire wiped the blood from her palms. The reality of his words settled over her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. "So what happens to me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gabriel leaned back, the shadows of the passing streetlights washing over the sharp angles of his face. "You saved my life," Gabriel said softly. "I don't like owing debts. And I don't throw away valuable assets. You work for me now." The SUV did not take Claire to a warehouse by the docks. It did not take her to a dimly lit basement. It drove for 45 minutes out of the city centre, winding up into the heavily wooded hills of the northern suburbs, before passing through a pair of massive wrought-iron gates. The estate was a sprawling, brutalist structure of concrete and dark glass, half swallowed by the surrounding pine forest. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a fortress pretending to be architectural art. Leo parked the vehicle in a subterranean garage that smelled of high-octane fuel and damp earth. Gabriel stepped out first. He didn't offer Claire a hand. He expected her to follow, and she did, because the alternative was standing alone in a garage filled with blacked-out vehicles and men carrying suppressed rifles. They took a private elevator up 3 floors. The doors parted with a soft chime, revealing a sprawling penthouse level. The floors were polished slate. The furniture was minimal, expensive, and completely devoid of warmth. Wall-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, pitch-black view of the forest. "Dominic?" Gabriel called out. A man appeared from a hallway to the left. He was older than Gabriel, perhaps in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a face that looked like it had been broken and reset multiple times. He wore a heavy wool sweater and carried an iPad. He took one look at Gabriel's ruined suit, the blood, and then at Claire, who was standing perfectly still, dripping rain and wine onto the slate floor. Dominic didn't flinch. He just tapped the screen of his tablet. "How bad?" "Grigory is dead. His 2 shadows are dead," Gabriel said, stripping off his ruined suit jacket and tossing it onto a white leather sofa. "The garage was compromised. We took the alley." Dominic's eyes flicked to Claire again. "And the civilian?" "She isn't a civilian anymore," Gabriel replied, walking toward a sleek, dark, wood wet bar. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a glass and drank it straight. He didn't offer her any. "She's the reason I walked out of that dining room." Grigory used a gutter dialect to order the hit. She translated it before they could draw. Dominic raised an eyebrow. The heavy, skeptical look he gave Claire made her want to shrink into the floorboards. She was acutely aware of how she looked. Her uniform was stained, her hair was plastered to her forehead, and she was wearing cheap, rubber-soled orthopedic shoes. She looked like exactly what she was. A minimum-wage worker who had accidentally stepped onto a landmine. "Get her a room in the east wing. No windows facing the perimeter. Lock the exterior doors," Gabriel ordered, setting his empty glass down with a sharp clink. "Have Dr. Evans look at her hands. She's in shock." "I'm not in shock," Claire said. Both men turned to look at her. The silence in the massive room was absolute. Claire surprised herself. Her voice was trembling, but the words were out. The academic, logical part of her brain was desperately trying to reassert control over the terrified animal inside her. "I have localized tremors due to an adrenal dump, and I likely have minor lacerations from shattered glass," Claire said, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "But my cognitive functions are completely intact. I am acutely aware of where I am and what just happened." Gabriel tilted his head. A faint, dark amusement touched the corners of his mouth. It was a terrifying expression. "Good," Gabriel said softly, "because tomorrow you go to work. Dominic, get her out of my sight." Dominic gestured down the long, shadowed hallway. "This way, miss." Claire followed him. She didn't look back at Gabriel. She focused on placing one foot in front of the other. The adrenaline was finally beginning to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made her limbs feel like lead. The room Dominic led her to was massive. It featured a king-sized bed with dark grey linens, a completely empty mahogany dresser, and an ensuite bathroom lined with black marble. It was immaculate. It was beautiful. It was a cell. "The doctor will be up in 10 minutes, Dominic said, lingering in the doorway. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You saved his life tonight." "I just repeated what I heard." Claire said numbly. In our world, those are the same thing. Dominic said, Don't try to leave the room. The perimeter is armed. If the dogs don't get you, the automated sensors will. He pulled the heavy door shut. The lock engaged with a heavy, definitive thud. Claire stood in the center of the room for a long time. She looked at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. A smear of Grigory's blood was streaked across her pale cheek. She looked like a ghost. She walked into the bathroom, turned the faucet to cold, and began to scrub her hands. She scrubbed until her skin was raw and pink, until the water running down the drain was entirely clear. She sat on the edge of the massive bed. She didn't cry. Crying required energy she simply didn't possess. Instead, a dark, deeply cynical laugh bubbled up in her chest. 6 years of university. 3 rejected grant proposals. Thousands of hours listening to grainy audio files of Russian mobsters threatening each other over stolen shipping containers. She had thought it was all a colossal waste of time. She had thought she was destined to serve overpriced wine to arrogant men until her knees gave out. She fell back onto the mattress, staring up at the vaulted ceiling. Congratulations, Claire, she thought. You finally got a job in your field. The isolation lasted exactly 36 hours. During that time, meals were brought on silver trays by a silent, terrified-looking maid. A doctor, a weary man who smelled heavily of menthol cigarettes and gin, came and picked the microscopic shards of green glass out of Claire's forearms, bandaging them with clinical efficiency. He didn't ask her name. He just told her to keep the wounds dry. Claire paced the room. She catalogued the books on the small shelf, mostly dry histories of the Roman Empire and a few leather-bound classics. She analyzed the architecture of the doorframe. She did everything she could to avoid thinking about the fact that she was the property of a crime syndicate. On the morning of the 3rd day, the lock clicked. Gabriel stood in the doorway. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, the knot of his tie perfectly symmetrical. The bruises from the near-miss bullet were hidden beneath the expensive wool, but she noticed a slight stiffness in his posture. "Come with me," he said. He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked down the hall. Claire followed. She was wearing clothes provided by the silent maid, a simple black turtleneck and dark jeans that fit perfectly. She felt less like a waitress and more like a participant. She wasn't sure which was worse. Gabriel led her down a spiral staircase to the ground floor, bypassing the living areas, and entering a heavy steel door that required a biometric scan to open. The room beyond was a sensory shock. It wasn't a dungeon. It was a server farm masquerading as an office. Banks of monitors lined the walls, scrolling through endless lines of data, security feeds, and shipping manifests. The air hummed with the sound of cooling fans. 3 men in shirt sleeves were working at various stations, wearing heavy headphones. They didn't look up when Gabriel entered. Gabriel walked to a heavy oak desk at the center of the room. He tapped the spacebar on a laptop, waking the screen. "Grigory's death created a vacuum," Gabriel said, leaning against the edge of the desk. He didn't look at her. He looked at the screen. "His lieutenants are scrambling. Half of them want to retaliate and burn my city down. The other half want to pack up their cargo and flee back to St. Petersburg. The problem is, I don't know which half is currently winning." He pointed to a pair of professional-grade studio headphones resting on the desk. "We tapped their central communications hub at the docks 2 weeks ago." Gabriel continued. "We have 72 hours of encrypted VoIP calls. My current translator is a kid who learned Russian off a commercial app. He can tell me they are angry. He can't tell me what they are actually planning." Claire looked at the headphones. They looked incredibly heavy. "You want me to translate wiretaps?" she said flatly. "I want you to tell me who is going to try to kill me next, and exactly what time they plan on doing it," Gabriel corrected, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "No." The word hung in the air. The three men at the workstations stopped typing. The hum of the cooling fans suddenly sounded deafening. Gabriel didn't blink. He just stared at her. "Excuse me?" Claire crossed her arms, digging her fingernails into the fabric of her turtleneck to hide the trembling of her hands. "I am a linguist, Mr. Russo. I am not an accessory to murder," she said, her voice tight but unwavering. "I saved your life because you were about to be ambushed in front of me. That was a reflex. This? Sitting in a war room, helping you hunt down your enemies? That's a choice. And I won't do it. I won't have blood on my hands." Gabriel let out a low, rough breath. He pushed off the desk and closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He stopped mere inches from her. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and imposing, and up close, the sheer physical gravity of him was suffocating. "Hold your hands out," he commanded softly. Claire pressed her arms tighter against her chest. "No." Gabriel reached out, wrapped his hands around her wrists, and physically pulled her arms forward. He turned her hands palms up. He didn't squeeze hard enough to bruise, but his grip was like iron. "Look at them," he ordered. Claire stared at her pale palms. The doctor had cleaned them, but in her mind, she could still feel the sticky warmth of the spilled wine mixed with the coppery slickness of whatever else had covered the restaurant floor. "You think you're clean?" Gabriel's voice was a low, brutal rasp near her ear. "You think because you didn't pull the trigger you're a bystander? Grigori is dead because you opened your mouth. His 2 men are dead because you opened your mouth. You stepped into the arena, Claire. The door is locked behind you. You already have blood on your hands." He released her wrists. Claire stumbled back half a step, her breathing shallow and fast. "You have a choice," Gabriel said, his tone shifting from aggressive to coldly practical. "You can sit in that bedroom upstairs, eating my food and staring at the wall until Grigori's men inevitably breach my perimeter and slaughter everyone in this house, including you. Or you can put those headphones on, do exactly what you spent 6 years learning how to do, and help me bury them before they get the chance." He stepped away, leaving the space open between her and the desk. "It's just vocabulary, Claire," Gabriel added softly. "You just have to tell me what the words mean." Claire stared at the laptop. She hated him. She hated his arrogance, his absolute certainty, and the cold, terrifying logic of his argument. He was right. She couldn't unring the bell. She was in the blast radius now. She walked slowly to the desk. She picked up the heavy headphones and slid them over her ears. Gabriel tapped a few keys on the laptop, opening a folder containing dozens of raw audio files. "Track 4, Gabriel said, leaning over her shoulder. He was close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive, sharp, and smelling faintly of cedar and cold air. It was intercepted 3 hours ago. 2 lieutenants, Yuri and Victor. Claire clicked play. The audio was terrible. It was heavily compressed, filled with the background hiss of maritime radios and the distant hum of diesel engines. But the voices cut through, deep, harsh, speaking in a rapid-fire cadence. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness focus her hearing. The academic part of her brain, the machine that had lain dormant while she poured water at the Florentine, instantly roared to life. She didn't just hear the words. She heard the stress patterns. She heard the dropped consonants that indicated panic. She heard the specific regional slang of the Viborg district. She hit pause. "Your guy was wrong," Claire said, her voice slipping into a flat, professional monotone. She grabbed a notepad and a pen from the desk. "What did he miss?" Gabriel asked. "Everything," Claire replied, writing furiously. "Your previous translator probably used a standard Moscow dialect dictionary. But these men aren't from Moscow. They're dock workers from the Gulf of Finland." She tapped her pen against the notepad. Yuri tells Victor to move the heavy iron to the red house. Your translator probably thought they were moving weapons to a literal safe house. Claire explained, looking up at Gabriel. But in Viborg slang, heavy iron doesn't mean guns. It means liquid assets, cash. And the Red House isn't a building. It's a specific cargo ship, usually flagged from Liberia, known for laundering money. Gabriel went perfectly still. His eyes narrowed. They aren't planning an attack, Claire concluded, dropping the pen. They're terrified of you. They are loading all their operational cash onto a freighter to smuggle it out of the city. They're cutting their losses. Gabriel stared at the notepad. He processed the information with terrifying speed. He looked at the 3 men at the workstations. "Leo!" Gabriel snapped. "Get a strike team to Pier 44. I want that Liberian freighter boarded before it leaves the breakwater. Confiscate the cargo. Sink the ship." The room erupted into quiet, urgent motion as the men began barking orders into radios. Gabriel turned back to Claire. The cold, calculating look in his eyes had shifted. It was replaced by something entirely different. It was a look of profound, genuine respect. "Track 5, Gabriel said softly, pointing to the screen. "Let's see what else they're hiding." They worked for 8 hours straight. The dynamic in the room slowly shifted. The terrifying Mafia boss and the captive waitress vanished. They were replaced by 2 professionals dismantling an empire piece by piece. Gabriel stood over her, analyzing the tactical maps on the secondary monitors. Claire sat with her eyes closed, listening to the static, isolating the slang, dissecting the panic in the Russian voices. She corrected him 3 times. He didn't argue. He listened. She realized something profound as the hours bled into night. Gabriel Russo didn't surround himself with yes-men. He survived by surrounding himself with competence. He didn't care about her background, her cheap uniform, or her bank account. He cared that her brain operated on a frequency he desperately needed. "Track 19, Claire murmured, rubbing her temples. A dull headache was building behind her eyes. The audio quality on this file was the worst yet. It was a phone call, heavily encrypted, bouncing off 3 different cell towers. She hit play. She listened to a man speaking Russian, but something was wrong. Claire stopped typing. She opened her eyes, staring blankly at the screen. She rewound the track 10 seconds. She played it again. The blood slowly drained from her face, leaving her feeling lightheaded and violently nauseous. Gabriel noticed the shift instantly. He stepped closer. "What is it? Are they moving on the compound?" Claire took off the headphones. Her hands were shaking again, much worse than they had been in the dining room. She looked up at Gabriel. "The man on this recording," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. "He's speaking Russian." "I know," Gabriel said, frowning. "That's why you're translating it." "No, you don't understand," Claire said, her voice dropping to a frantic, terrified whisper. "He's speaking Russian, but it isn't his native language. His vowels are too flat. He's translating his thoughts from English into Russian before he speaks. He has a distinct, localized American accent hidden underneath the syllables." Gabriel's face went blank. The stillness returned. The dangerous apex predator stillness. "What is he saying?" Gabriel asked. The temperature in the room plummeted. "He's talking to Grigori's second-in-command," Claire said, looking down at her notepad. She couldn't bring herself to look Gabriel in the eye. "He's apologizing that the ambush at the restaurant failed, and he is giving them the security access codes to this compound." Gabriel didn't move. He didn't breathe. "It's a mole," Claire whispered, the horrifying reality settling over her. "Someone in your organization set you up at the Florentine, and they just sold out this house." Gabriel reached over and unplugged the headphones from the laptop. The audio suddenly blared out into the room through the computer's speakers. The voice was distorted, coated in digital static, but it was clear enough to make out the cadence, the rhythm of the breathing, the specific pause before certain consonants. The three men in the room stopped working. They turned around. Gabriel listened to the recording for a full 30 seconds. He didn't react outwardly. His face was a mask carved from stone. But Claire, sitting inches away from him, could feel the catastrophic shift in his energy. It was like standing next to a dormant volcano the second before the mountain split open. Gabriel reached out and closed the laptop with a soft, definitive click. The silence in the room was suffocating. "Leo," Gabriel said. His voice was perfectly even. Too even. The massive driver stepped away from his console, his face pale. "Boss, that's not—" "Draw your weapon and put it on the desk." Gabriel interrupted, his tone gentle, almost conversational. Leo swallowed hard. He looked at the other two men in the room, who immediately stepped back, creating a physical distance between themselves and the driver. Leo slowly reached under his jacket, pulled out his heavy Glock, and placed it on the oak desk. "Now," Gabriel said, leaning forward slightly. "Tell me why you gave Grigori the floor plans to the Florentine." Leo's hands went up in a placating gesture. "Gabriel, you have to listen to me. It wasn't like that. Grigori had my brother. They pulled him off the street 3 days ago in Southside. They sent me a video. They were going to take him apart piece by piece." Gabriel didn't look angry. He looked profoundly disappointed. It was somehow far more terrifying than rage. "You should have come to me," Gabriel said softly. "You would have gone to war," Leo pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "You would have burned the city down, and they would have killed him in the crossfire. Grigori promised me. He said if I just gave him the restaurant schedule, he would let my brother go. He said it was just a shakedown. I didn't know he was going to kill you." "And the security codes for this house?" Gabriel asked, gesturing to the closed laptop. "Was that just a shakedown too?" Leo's shoulders slumped. The fight went out of him completely. "After the restaurant failed, they called me. They said they knew I drove you out. They said if I didn't give them the gate codes, my brother was dead in an hour." Gabriel looked at Leo for a long, terrible moment. These were men who had bled together, men who had built an empire on the concrete and the corpses of their rivals. And it had all been undone by a phone call and a terrified older brother. Gabriel turned to the two remaining men. "Take him down to the basement," Gabriel ordered, his voice devoid of any human emotion. "Find out exactly where they are holding his brother. Once you have the location, shoot him." Leo didn't scream. He didn't fight. He simply nodded, a slow, resigned movement, as the two men grabbed his arms and hauled him toward the steel door. He had known the rules when he signed up. Betrayal had only one price, regardless of the motive. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving Gabriel and Claire entirely alone in the server room. Claire sat completely frozen in the desk chair. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard it ached. She had just essentially signed a man's death warrant. She had just played God with her vocabulary. Gabriel stood leaning against the desk, staring at the closed door. For the first time since she had met him, his posture slumped. The immaculate, terrifying facade cracked just for a fraction of a second, revealing the immense, crushing weight of the crown he wore. He ran a hand over his face, a deeply exhausted gesture. He turned and looked at Claire. She braced herself, expecting him to be cold, expecting him to dismiss her back to her gilded cage. Instead, Gabriel reached out and pulled the rolling chair she was sitting in slightly away from the desk, turning her so she was facing him directly. He crouched down, bringing himself to eye level with her. It was a deeply vulnerable position. He was exposing his throat to her, physically lowering his physical dominance in the space. "You are shaking," Gabriel noted, his voice a low, rough murmur. "You're going to kill him," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. He was trying to save his brother. "I am going to kill him, because if I don't, the rest of my men will realize that betrayal is a forgivable offense." Gabriel said, his dark eyes locked onto hers. He wasn't defending himself, he was explaining the grim physics of his reality. If I show mercy, I look weak. If I look weak, we all die. That is the world we live in. I don't live in this world, Claire said, a tear finally breaking free and tracking hot down her cheek. Gabriel reached out. He didn't grab her. He slowly, deliberately raised his hand and wiped the tear from her jawline with the pad of his thumb. His skin was rough, calloused from years of violence, but his touch was shockingly gentle. You do now, Gabriel said softly. He didn't say it like a threat. He said it like a vow. I have 500 men working for me. Gabriel continued, his voice dropping to a barely audible rasp. I pay them fortunes, I give them power, and any one of them would put a bullet in my back if the price was right. They lie to me in English. They lie to me in Italian. He moved his hand, his fingers lightly curling around the back of her neck, an anchor in the storm of the room. But they can't lie to you, he whispered. Claire stared into his dark eyes. The cynicism, the fear, the exhaustion, it all stripped away, leaving only a raw, terrifying clarity. She wasn't a hostage anymore. She was a weapon. She was a radar system for a man walking through a minefield. You said you didn't want blood on your hands, Gabriel said, his thumb resting gently against her pulse point. I can't promise you that. The blood is already there. But I can promise you this. No one in this city will ever look right through you again. You will never be invisible again. Claire felt the heavy, rhythmic thud of his heart radiating from his chest. She realized, with a terrifying jolt of adrenaline that had nothing to do with fear, that she didn't want to leave. The waitress was dead. The academic was dead. She looked at the Mafia boss, the ruthless executioner who had just knelt in front of her, entirely dependent on the specific architecture of her mind. Change the gate codes, Claire said, her voice finally steady, cold and precise. Then let's find out where they're keeping his brother. Gabriel smiled. It wasn't the cruel, arrogant smirk from the restaurant. It was a dark, genuine, terrifying promise. Translate the rest of the files, Gabriel commanded softly, standing up. Let's burn them to the ground. Did Claire just make the biggest mistake of her life, or did she just become the most powerful woman in the city's criminal underworld? The chemistry between her and Gabriel is absolute fire, built on trust in a world where trust gets you killed. If you loved this dark, slow-burn Mafia romance, smash that like button and share it with someone who loves a badass heroine who uses her brain as a weapon. Subscribe and turn on notifications. You do not want to miss the fallout in the next episode. What would you have done in Claire's shoes? Comment below.